This is the story about how a Canadian skyjacking case was solved by a simple Google search a whole 30 years later. On the night of December 26, 1971, Air Canada Flight 932 was traveling from Thunder Bay, Ontario to Toronto. 20 minutes before the plane was due to land, a young man entered the galley and handed a note to a stewardess. It read, "Think, we have fragmentary grenades and a .38 caliber revolver. Take me to the captain, we're going to Havana, this is no joke." And sure enough, the man was actually holding a grenade and a handgun. He made his way into the cockpit and demanded that the pilots continue flying to Toronto International Airport, and so they did. The plane landed, and the 83 passengers on board had no clue a hijacking took place until they were already off the plane. The pilot tipped off the authorities while en route, so Transport Canada and Peel Regional Police were on the scene. After some back and forth over the radio with the suspect, two rookie police officers decided that the safest bet was to fulfill the hijacker's demands, which was to refuel the plane and fly him to Cuba. Air Canada Flight 932 then began the 4-hour journey south. They made it to Havana without a hitch, and once landed, the suspect was taken into custody by Cuban officials. Flight 932 and its crew were then allowed to leave. They made it back to Toronto at around 5:30 in the morning and were immediately questioned by police. Surprisingly, one of the stewardess had a conversation with the suspect before the hijacking and was able to get his name. The suspect was then 24-year-old Patrick Critton, an American from Harlem, New York, who had a criminal past. He was part of a black liberation group called the Republic of New Africa and would help manufacture explosives and take part in bank robberies to fund the group. One of those robberies, which would eventually lead up to the hijacking, went down in Manhattan on July 29, 1971. Patrick and 4 armed accomplices stormed into a banker's trust on Broadway and 94th Street. The police were notified by a silent alarm in the bank, and once they arrived, the suspects took 12 hostages before a gun battle ensued. In the end, one of the suspects was taken out, another was critically injured, and 2 were in custody. But one of the men managed to escape, Patrick Critton, who acted as a lookout for the heist. Patrick believed he was now wanted by the police, so he went on the run and fled north into Canada. It only took him a few months in the country to get his hands on weapons and formulate a plan, hijack an aircraft, and get to Cuba. In the late 1960s and early 70s, skyjacking was an epidemic in America, and Cuba was a hot spot for those on the run from the law. The US doesn't have an extradition treaty with Cuba, so American fugitives were virtually untouchable once on Cuban soil. Patrick was well aware of this, and he became the first person to successfully hijack an aircraft in Canada. But once he landed in Cuba and was arrested, he was sent to a dormitory in South Havana, known as Casa de Transitos, the hijacker's house. Residents of the dorm were allotted just 16 square feet of living space, and Patrick spent 8 months living there. Afterward, he was forced to work in a sugarcane field for 2 years before moving to East Africa in 1974. By that time, there was a Canadian warrant issued for Patrick's arrest, but authorities didn't know where he was. He started a new life in Tanzania, where he would marry, have 2 sons, and become a history teacher. Nearly 20 years later, in 1991, Patrick decided he wanted to return to the United States. He applied for an American passport, and somehow his application was approved. By 1994, Patrick was back in Harlem, New York, and landed a job as a teacher with the Board of Education, hosting SAT prep classes. It seemed like he was in the clear and had gotten away with a skyjacking scot-free. The case went cold, and the file sat on a dusty shelf at a Peel Region police station. But one day in 2001, Donald Jorgensen, a detective with an unbeaten track record, chose to revisit the case. He began his investigation with minimal information about Patrick, his name, date of birth, and physical description. He ran Patrick's name through the police database with no luck. He then decided to open up his internet browser and simply search for Patrick Critton's name on Google. He skimmed through the results until he came across an article on a New York News website about mentors for black youth. One of the mentors was none other than Patrick Critton. He was now a director of a community school in Mount Vernon, New York, and also taught in a youth shelter. Now with a solid lead, the first step was to confirm Patrick's identity. So Detective Jorgensen called up a friend from the NYPD and asked him to snap a picture of Patrick. In the photo, Patrick matched the physical description that the police had and was now a prime suspect. He was put under heavy surveillance until investigators became familiar with his daily routine and came up with a plot. Decades earlier, when Flight 932 returned to Toronto and the crew was questioned, one of the stewardess gave police a soda can that Patrick drank from. So they already had his DNA and just needed a new sample to compare it with. On August 15, 2001, police officers posted up along Patrick's walk to work and were putting up flyers of a missing girl. As Patrick walked by, an officer asked him if he'd seen the girl in the picture. Patrick grabbed the picture, looked at it, and then handed it back, unknowingly providing his fingerprints. The forensics results showed that the prints on the photograph matched the prints that were on the soda can. Now that they were sure it was Patrick Critton, Canadian investigators flew to New York with a warrant and extradition papers. On September 8, 2001, police showed up at Patrick Critton's apartment in Mount Vernon. When Patrick was approached by the officers, his first words were, "What took you so long?" before being placed in handcuffs and taken to jail. He remained in custody in New York for a few months before he was extradited to Canada on November 6, 2001. About a year later, in June of 2002, he was tried for the crimes of kidnapping and extortion. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment with a credit for time served of 2 years. Because the crime took place at a time where there weren't established air piracy laws in Canada, he wasn't directly charged with hijacking a plane. In June of 2003, Patrick was released after serving 1/3 of his sentence, which was only a year. He was deported back to the United States and moved in with his mother in the Bronx, New York. He would later self-publish an autobiography called Lion in the Foliage, Full Moon in the Sky. It's reported that he's now back in Tanzania with his wife, who's an educator on a game reserve. It's said that Patrick is now a house husband because his teaching days are now over due to his criminal record. In conclusion, what Patrick did is nowadays next to impossible, since security at airports has bumped up drastically since the events of 9/11. Before then, it was the golden age of hijacking, and Patrick's case was just one of many. His story may be lesser known, but it still goes down in history as the first successful skyjacking in Canada.